Hello everybody, my name is Sam Gordon and I'm a program officer here at the U.S. Department of State, where I work on educational, cultural, and technological workshops. I'm coming to you live from our lovely studios in Washington, D.C. at the State Department, where we're thrilled to have our second installment in our YSEALI Tech Tuesday series today. Every Tuesday this month we will have a Tech Tuesday Facebook Live chat with a tech expert on a different topic, and today I have the honor and privilege of talking with Adriel Luis about design thinking. Adriel is a digital and emerging media curator at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, and today he's got to chat with us about why design thinking is important and how it can impact basically anything you do online or offline. Please ask your questions for Adriel in the comments section below or on Twitter using the hashtag TechTuesday. And also, please do let us know where you're watching from. All right, Adriel, before we dive a little bit more into the topic of design thinking, I want to do a quick speed round of questions. That way the audience can get to know you and your topic a little bit better. So, first off, what type of work do you do for the Smithsonian Institution?
Hi, Sam. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Hello, YSEALI. My name is Adriel Luis, and I am a curator at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center.
Awesome. And what does a curator do exactly?
So a curator uses art, history, science, culture to help people understand topics better. And I focus on community groups and community development. And so all my work is about bringing people together.
Fantastic. That sounds very rewarding. Where can people go if they want to learn a little bit more about the Asian Pacific American Center? And where is the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center located?
Yeah, so the Smithsonian is kind of like a Hogwarts campus with a bunch of different museums, art museums, science museums, history museums. The Asian Pacific American Center doesn't have a traditional museum, and so we actually create pop-up experiences in different parts of the United States and eventually pop-ups all throughout the world.
Fantastic. So you're here to talk to us today about design thinking. What is design thinking?
So design thinking is a way of problem solving that is focused more on a grand solution as opposed to a problem. So a lot of people are familiar with a scientific method where you think like a scientist to solve a problem. So with design thinking, you think like a designer. You use creativity and imagination, really to kind of think outside the box and solve large problems.
Fantastic. And what kind of inspired you to get into the fields of design and technology?
So my mom is a graphic designer and my dad is a computer engineer. So, I basically grew up with a computer in my living room, but also a lot of really beautiful things, really well organized kinds of design. And so I think having that all around me just inspired me to kind of merge those two concepts.
Very cool. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about you and a little bit more about design thinking, let us kind of dive into, so why is this an important subject for people to kind of get to know about?
So I mean, we're surrounded by design all the time. I think a lot of times people think about design as just like really pretty things, but actually good design is all about making a point. And so, for example, a well-designed exit sign is something that would be easy to see and also really bold and direct and understandable. And then a great design would be also if it's a really beautiful exit sign, right? And so I think for us to understand good design is for us to understand how to make a point in a really clear and succinct way.
Awesome. Yeah, I love the distinction kind of between just design and design thinking. I know that for our audience, that's definitely something that we kind of want to delve into a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think even as a designer, the terminology of design thinking is relatively new to me. And so, with just design, I think a lot of that is, again, using aesthetic, whether that's graphics or sound towards making a point. With design thinking, you don't necessarily have to be thinking about design. So you don't have to only use design thinking to think about building a website or making a poster or a flyer. It's also about thinking about problems that I think normally we wouldn't naturally be inclined to use our imagination. We realize that we can actually address topics as serious as poverty or hunger or crime by really thinking outside the box.
Fantastic. And now I kind of want to ask the audience a direct question. This is a part where we make it a little bit more interactive and you can tune in. So what brands inspire you and why? And again, that question is, what brands inspire you in particular and why? Please write your answers in the comment sections below, and we'll read off some of your answers later in the program. Adriel, same question. Are there any particular brands that kind of inspire you?
There's a company that I think a lot of folks are familiar with, especially in Asia, that's called Muji, and it is a place that sells sort of like housewares and clothing and things like that, but it uses a really minimalist approach, which I think is really great for reflecting a lot of the design sensibilities of Japan. So it not only represents its own self, but also kind of the culture that it comes from. I'm also really inspired by the Marvel branding. I think for a company that's been around for a really long time, and also a company that has kind of transformed from focusing mostly on comic books to also doing films and even having amusement parks and things like that. It's really found its way to keep a tone that I think is familiar, even if you kind of like grew up with Spider-Man comic books. When you watch X-Men films, you feel that same kind of feel. And then I think the Barack Obama logo and branding is also really inspiring for me, I think, as someone who wasn't compelled by politics. Seeing a campaign that focused a lot on design and aesthetic has really switched the game. So now a lot of candidates, a lot of people in government are using logos as well.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been a game changer, especially on the last point in the way that political campaigns are run nowadays. So I heard that you have a secret 5 basic step toolkit when it comes to design thinking. Can you tell us a little bit about the approach and method?
Sure. It's not so secret, and it's not something that I necessarily came up with, and so just want to put it out there that this is, these are really basic takes on design thinking. Sometimes people will list 3 steps, sometimes people will list 12, but I kind of see 5 major steps that you can apply towards kind of any problem solving using design thinking. So the first is really important, and it's empathy, and that is something that I think oftentimes, especially with social issues, we think about a bigger picture, large communities or nations, but to really empathize means understanding where someone is coming from on an individual basis. And then to understand the situation means that now that you've put yourself in someone else's shoes, how do you actually get a sense of what it is that people are needing or longing for, or what is it that needs to be solved? And then the third step is how do we solve that, right? And so a lot of times people will think about that as kind of coming up with concepts or solutions. I like to actually take it a step further and think about dreaming big, right? And so from the background as an artist, when you see a piece of canvas, you don't just think about a painting, you really think about a vision. And it's kind of the same thing with dreaming big. And fourth is then you make stuff, like I guess the proper terminology would be like prototyping, but you take your ideas and then you manifest it in physical or digital form, basically in a way that becomes shareable. And then the last step is actually then sharing it. So once you've created your prototype, you share it with either a small group of people or with your community, and then you get feedback. And then you take that feedback and then you prototype again, and then you get feedback again. And then so the last kind of 3, 4, and 5, those steps, you really kind of do it over and over again until you land on a solution that you're happy with.
Definitely very user-centric, and I love the kind of built-in feedback model to it. Great way to kind of iterate. I'm curious, how do you kind of apply these 5 steps into your everyday work?
Like I said, the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center is not a traditional museum, and also the community that we outreach to is not a traditional community in a sense of how the Smithsonian envisioned audiences when it first opened in the late 1800s. And so a lot of our community, are folks who are immigrants or children of immigrants. They're folks who come from cultures that don't necessarily have museum going embedded in their backgrounds. And so how do we talk about stories in ways that really appeal to them, right? And so kind of following those 5 steps, by empathizing, we took a look at the Asian Pacific American community and thought about the fact that, well, if these are folks that don't necessarily have great grandparents who have a tradition of going to the Smithsonian, then how do we kind of meet them from another perspective, right? Understanding the situation meant that we then looked at well, where are the places that our community does get art and culture? So like block parties, flea markets, barbecues, things like that. And then dreaming big was thinking about, well, now how do we actually shift the way that people experience museums in ways that immigrant groups, Asian Pacific Americans, and communities of color can resonate with. And so that was about not just kind of creating a one-off kind of a model, but actually something that other museums and organizations can be inspired by. And then the fourth is making stuff. And so we actually started popping up our culture labs. We've done 3 so far, one in DC, and then New York, and then Honolulu, Hawaii. And all of those are basically like these big experiments that we work on with about 50 artists. We share with the public for a couple of days, and then we go back and kind of think about how we can do the next one even better. And so that's kind of the 5th one where, after we pop up the show, we really ask folks. We ask the artists, we ask the audience how their experience was, how we can make things better, and then in less than a year, we pop up another one to kind of. And so the next one that we're working on will be in the fall in Philadelphia.
Great. Yeah. It's such a great range of like exhibits and projects that you're working on. I'm kind of curious, where do you get the inspiration when it comes to designing new projects and building them out?
Yeah, I'm into really weird kinds of like music and films, and I think that sometimes the best kinds of design are ones that are new and fresh and unique, but at the same time can resonate with people from a massive scale. And so, after I listen to like all my really weird vinyl, then I also try to, pop in like some Katy Perry or, just get a sense of a balance, right? I think really great design will show itself and as something that people feel like they can recognize, even though they've never seen it before. And so I try to watch blockbuster films, listen to pop music, go to really popular museums, and then balance that with kind of all the other maybe less known things that I think that people would really enjoy if they knew more about it.
Great. And how might different people approach design thinking for their own purposes and goals? You kind of apply it to art. What are ways that other people can kind of apply it to their general work?
So I think that when you're thinking with design thinking, it's all about kind of zooming out and getting a sense of what are major problems that you could solve. And so with most projects, you could zoom out far enough where you're like, I'm trying to save the universe. But sometimes you're really just trying to open a cupcake factory or something, right? And so I recommend that when you're applying design thinking, you kind of zoom out, just like a couple of notches, right? So that you're looking at like a little bit of a bigger picture than what you're normally looking at. And so a great example is oftentimes someone will approach me saying that they want their website redesigned. And then, so my first question will be like, well, what's the purpose of your website redesign? Let's look back and think about what you're trying to accomplish with this redesign. And then when we look at the bigger picture, sometimes we might realize that actually what you're needing isn't necessarily a website redesign, but just to make more cupcakes or different flavors, or maybe enhance your social media or find other ways of outreach. And so, but I think oftentimes when people don't apply design thinking into a project, they get really narrow into the specificity of whatever it is that they're working on. And sometimes that can kind of almost, you work a bunch on a project, and when you don't contextualize it with something bigger, it can kind of feel like throwing a hot dog down a hallway, right? And so you really want to figure out ways that whatever you're working on can actually make a bigger impact than just you satisfying the goal of completing a project.
Perfect. All right, so Adriel, before we get to a couple more questions about yourself, I'm interested in kind of hearing back from our viewers. I want to read off the results of the question that we asked a little bit earlier in the program about what brands inspire you and why. So we have a couple examples now. We have a Grab Bike in the Philippines, which is a great kind of like Uber on the go service that you can kind of use. We have Google. That's top tech company in the world. Definitely a great choice. William says that we have Facebook because it has brought the world a little bit closer together. We're using it right now. And with that, let's get to a couple more questions from our viewers. So they're asking, you've been to Indonesia and various other places throughout Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Singapore. And I know very recently you were actually in Jakarta, Indonesia, for a tech camp program that we helped put on. What was your favorite thing about your trip to Jakarta?
I really love the global South in general. I think as someone who was born and raised in the U.S., there are a lot of aesthetic things that I never really questioned because they come from a Western point of view. And so being somewhere, especially in Southeast Asia, really kind of changes the dial in terms of understanding, what people are into aesthetically. That cultures can come from places that have been around for much longer than the United States. And so when we go to our American History Museum, it kind of begins in like 1776. And then when we went to the National Museum in Indonesia, it like began with the start of humans, right? And so it was like, I think I really love going to places where you can really track a culture all the way from like the beginning of the beginning of the beginning.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, the museums were definitely a big, amazing cultural experience in Jakarta, for sure. We have a couple more of our favorite brands from viewers. So TechStart is another company that is really kind of inspirational. And then we also have individuals talking about Rolls-Royce, the brand, for the classic car. Kind of going off that question, I'm a little bit curious. Do you have any favorite museums or artists in Southeast Asia that really resonate with you?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the National Museum in Jakarta was really awesome. I actually also, when I was in Manila, I ended up, I went to a museum that was inside of a bank. Okay. And it was raining really hard, and we were basically trying to figure out where to go, and a security guard just kind of pointed to a bank and said, I think that there's a museum in there. And we went in, and there was like maybe 2 other people in the museum. It wasn't a huge museum, but it basically traced the history of the Philippines using currency. Okay. So starting with gold pieces and like Chinese coins and things that were traded throughout Southeast Asia and Asia, and then all the way through like Spanish currency and Japanese currency, American currency, and then now the currency that they have today. And so it was a really interesting way to take something that I'm familiar with, not that familiar with, but kind of familiar with currency, and helping me understand a history that I'm not very familiar with. So I really appreciate that museum for that. And also in general, I tend to go to art museums. And so stumbling into a museum that was not at all an art museum, but learning so much out of it, I thought was an amazing experience.
That's great. Yeah. With museums, it's often a balance between aesthetics and information. I'm very curious kind of about the balance in your own work, and then how does that kind of shape what you want to convey?
Yeah, so for me personally, as you may be able to tell, audience, I ramble. And so I'm always practicing how I can make a point across in the most straightforward way possible, which is really what design is about too. And so when you see a poster as an audience member, oftentimes you'll notice the things that attract you, the shapes and the colors and the fonts that are pretty. And so again, that can make someone feel like design is all about just making stuff pretty, but really it's about clarity. And so if you're designing a poster, the fonts are chosen not just because of how nice they look, but also because of how easy they may be to read. If you're thinking about someone seeing a poster or a sign from far away, then you want to make it big. If you want if you want it to be something that you don't need people to read, sometimes like a copyright or something like that, then you'll make it really small. People will choose bright colors or muted colors depending on the kind of emotion they want to convey. And so it really is about intentionality. And I think that kind of design thinking can be applied towards pretty much any aspect of life. And so in my everyday, I almost think of my days as days that I can design. I think about what I would like to accomplish each day, what would make me fulfilled, and then I kind of plot out my schedule based on that.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely a great way to kind of approach an everyday life. I know that we're getting a couple more responses and questions from our viewers across the globe and in Southeast Asia in particular. I know Crystal Eunice is saying that she uses design thinking processes to kind of come up and with ideal prototypes for local governance. I'm kind of curious, Adriel, how do you think design thinking can kind of be used in local government or national government?
Yeah, so there was a curator that once told me that her job was a series of turning no's into yeses, and I thought that that was a great way to make navigating a bureaucracy sound almost like a game. And so I know for me, working at the Smithsonian, that's my first kind of really formal position. Before that, I was freelance and a full-time artist. And so I think with government in general, anywhere you are, bureaucracy is a major issue. And so this is where design thinking really helps you think about the bigger picture, right? And so not only does it help remind you that, I'm doing all this paperwork because it's for a good cause, but also it helps you understand kind of how to prioritize different things, right? So if you understand what the big problem is that you're trying to solve, then when you are looking at 5 different tasks you have to accomplish and there are different levels of difficulty, you kind of know which ones are a bit more urgent or which ones might help make other tasks easier to do.
That's fantastic. We are getting in more and more viewer questions. So Santhaner Chandran asks, how do you teach children design thinking?
Yeah, so I think not just children, but people in general, like even though we're surrounded by design, oftentimes it can feel very abstract. I think there are a lot of incredible apps that help you understand, not just design thinking, but also how to design. I think that actually learning how to design is a great way to then learn design thinking. I know that Adobe puts out a lot of great apps for mobile phones that are either free or not too expensive, and you can kind of just doodle around with it, learn how to make a meme or make a graphic or a flyer, and then think about how that way of thinking may be applied towards other things you do in your life.
That's great. Noonan Chanlada asks, is there a kind of a best prototype that you've done before? Is there an example that you could kind of give that could be kind of inspirational to our audience abroad?
Sure. So I know that when I was designing a lot of websites, I would skip prototypes because I'd be like, oh, I'm so talented, I could just like knock it out on the first draft, and then I would show the client, and they'd be like, no, this looks nothing like I want, right? And so that's where I learned really the value of prototyping, taking that step of leading people through a process. Mm-hmm. And I think that actually becomes a strength is, for example, if I'm designing a website for someone who doesn't even know how websites work, showing them kind of a wireframe, which is basically like a bunch of boxes that show you where the different sections and graphics and text will go, that helps people understand what the skeleton of a website looks like. And then you show them a template, and then you show them a demo. And then so all those different stages for someone who's never been through that process becomes an educational experience. And so for me as a graphic designer, I learned that not only was my job to actually end up with the result of a great design, but also lead someone through them understanding sometimes their first experience of how to actually intentionally move with design.
That's great. Kind of intentionally moving with design kind of leads into the next question pretty smoothly. Jara Brilliance asks, is design thinking for everyone? I must say that they've been trying to train their staff, but it's been a little bit difficult.
I think that design thinking is it's not meant to be a science, right? And so I think with a scientific method, there's a particular way of going about experimentation that's been kind of tried and proven, and that's why in the field of science they go about that. But with design, it's always about thinking about new pathways and forging your own ground. And so my explanation of design thinking might vary from the way someone else would explain design thinking. And it's really about the context of the situation in which you're working with the design, and then also what it is that you're trying to solve. And so I think the basic understanding of design thinking is in situations where you're looking to solve a problem and you look around and it seems like no one else is applying creativity or imagination, that's your opportunity to then think like a designer, apply some creativity and imagination, and really even think aspirationally, sometimes even optimistically about the problem you're trying to solve. And then that's a great way to know that you're at least beginning to apply design thinking.
That's great. And I'm kind of curious, so Huidek may ask, design thinking is obviously an awesome tool, but in your opinion, kind of what are the limitations of it?
I think that, that's a really great question. I think that in the beginning with design thinking, a lot of times, if you haven't really exercised a creative muscle in your job, for example, then it can take a while to get used to for an individual. And then if you're trying to then apply design thinking towards an entire staff of people, let's say like in a government agency that hardly ever uses the concept or term creativity, then that also becomes a challenge. And so I think taking those small steps, learning how to get comfortable with how your team might be able to apply creativity and imagination in what they do is a great way to kind of dip your toe in the water, see how it works, and then kind of navigate from there. So you can actually use design thinking as a method of trying to bring design thinking into it, right? And so like you create a prototype for how your team might use design thinking, see how they react to that, and then try again and try again.
Great. Jane is asking us right now, how can you kind of apply design thinking to maybe designing new school curriculum?
So I think that design thinking is actually an awesome tool for not just schools in Asia, but also just like a lot of places where education is something that can be applied through non-Western ways, right? And so a lot of our global understanding of education, what makes people intelligent or smart, are through these Western frameworks of learning and knowing through standardized tests, SATs, and things like that. But when we look at places where education and learning has been around long before the education system as we know it, there are actually really cool and creative ways of knowing, right? And so a good way to apply design thinking is to not just look at a traditional curriculum as your school might currently frame it, but also dig deep into the history of your own country or of your region, or even look at ways that education in untraditional ways have worked in countries far outside of where you're from. And then seeing how you can take crumbs from those different kinds of methods to create your own kind of approach towards education.
Fantastic. Sophia is asking us, what are the different main skill sets that people need when approaching design thinking?
I think that more than skills, it's really about certain values. And I think that, so for example, learning not to be too scared to make mistakes or fail, I think is a great thing to learn. I think also being able to take criticism and feedback. Oftentimes, if you're creating a prototype and you send it out into the world and then people are pointing out things that they might not like about it, oftentimes, I know for me, I feel compelled to just be like, okay, fine, if you don't like it, I'm just going to take it home and just enjoy it myself, right? But actually, what's when you think about the bigger picture, then you're like, okay, well, let me take that feedback and actually think about the fact that what I was making wasn't just for me, but also for a larger community. So if this community is telling me something, then let me actually like apply the skill of taking feedback well, and then create something new out of that.
That's great. Learning to take feedback is always kind of useful for designing great programs. Jane is asking us, what's a good way of rolling out or introducing design thinking kind of in larger organizations? Maybe one that already kind of has its own way of doing things. So again, I think this kind of harkens back to the idea of thinking about design thinking maybe in a bureaucracy or kind of a large corporation and how you can be nimble in that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Working at the Smithsonian, we've been around as an institution since the late 1800s, so well over 100 years. There are definitely a lot of things that the Smithsonian believes that it's defined by these certain aesthetics or these certain approaches. And so as someone new coming in and wanting to bring something maybe unfamiliar to an old institution, that can be really challenging. I think for me, because I came in doing things like social media, responsive web design, meaning making websites for mobile phones and different devices. Those are things that, like, even if your organization or company has been around for a super long time, they can't have been doing social media for that long because social media hasn't been around for that long, right? Or they couldn't have really been making mobile-friendly websites for that long because we all haven't been making it for that long. And so kind of finding entry points where a concept is not just new to your organization, but also just new to the world in general, that can be a great place to suggest like, hey, like here's a place where, there's really room for us to innovate. And again, with design thinking, it's like, if we create something great, it's not just going to improve our organization, it's also going to improve the ways that other organizations can go about like their social media or their responsive design or whatever it is.
Something that's been coming up more and more is, how design thinking can kind of work in entrepreneurship. So I'm kind of curious, how do you pitch ideas to different leaders, potential funders, angel investors, areas like that?
Great. That's another great question. And again, I would go back to like the 5 steps of design thinking, and the first one meaning to empathize. And so, when we think about empathy and problem solving, we normally think about like victims or people who are kind of like quote in need. But empathy can also work in like across the board. So not just with people in need, or not just with audiences, but also with potential funders, right? And so, for example, when I'm applying for funding or for support from an organization, I'll go on their website, read about their history, get a sense of what are projects that they seem really excited about, and how my project can help with whatever it is that they're working on. And so there might be an organization that is really, really interested in gender equity, right? And it shows kind of in the way that they've been hiring, it shows in the kinds of projects that they've been funding, or even in their about statement. And so if I'm working on a project, I think about, well, like maybe my project might not have included those particular aspects originally, but maybe my project could be improved if I think about this kind of equity, or if I think about also incorporating this kind of problem solving into what I do. And then that way I get to do the project that I think would be really great. It also helps the organization that I'm seeking support for, and it also kind of expands the scope of the project into something that maybe in the beginning I wasn't thinking about.
That's great. I'm kind of curious, it's a little bit of a segue, but what are kind of some of your favorite apps and platforms when designing different products? So I think that I definitely like to use the Adobe suite, and so I'm on Photoshop and Illustrator and InDesign all the time. I think Instagram, especially like Instagram and Snapchat with their stories, are also kind of a great way that a lot of folks are using to think about design, right? And so with that, it's very easy to like come up with different colored text, or make it different sizes, or decorate using emojis. And again, you're trying to make a point, you're trying to tell a story. And so really interesting and amazing design aesthetics have come out of Instagram stories, even though it's a very simple platform. I think more and more like companies are just kind of using Instagram really kind of to even launch new campaigns. And I'm very kind of curious, what tips do you have for launching new products and programs like that?
I think that again, like with design, I guess switching from design thinking into just kind of graphic design in general, aesthetics can be a great way to kind of wake up an audience, right? And so whenever a company these days, whenever a really well-known company like changes its logo or something, it like sparks a controversy and everybody wants to talk about it online. It almost becomes its own kind of publicity stunt. And that wasn't always the case. It used to be a point where when a company would change its logo, only kind of like design nerds would care. But now, like people really feel a sense of ownership of a brand. And so it's actually a good thing when people kind of debate whether or not your logo should have changed and things like that. And so I think that, for an organization that's looking to kind of like show that it's moving in a new direction, philosophically or value-wise, a great way to kind of indicate that is to maybe like, start an Instagram account if you don't already have one, or like start tweeting more often than you were before, or start creating some really compelling graphics. If before you were mostly just posting text updates on Facebook, now start posting videos and graphics and things like that. That's a great way to indicate that now to your audience that now you're thinking in a different way.
Perfect. We have a couple more audience questions. Rhinath is asking us, what kind of methodology works when you're trying to propose solutions to diverse communities, or maybe a multicultural community?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because a lot of the work that we do at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center is dealing with a really diverse community of Asian Pacific Americans. We have folks, East Asians, we have Southeast Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and then also folks who are based in a bunch of different regions throughout the country. And then on top of that, we don't only work with Asian Pacific Americans, and so we're working with large communities in general. And so the way that we did a cultural lab in Honolulu was very different than the way that we're going to do a cultural lab in Philadelphia, right? So Honolulu has a bunch of Asians and Pacific Islanders. Philadelphia has a largely Black community. And so, again, going back to the first step of design thinking, it's really thinking about empathy, right? So understanding where is this community coming from and how can it best be served. And then the second step is understanding kind of what is it that's lacking, right? So in Honolulu, there aren't a lot of art museums. And so creating a massive art event is a very different situation than Philadelphia, where there are quite a lot of museums and galleries. And so the way that we're thinking about Philadelphia is, okay, well, if there's already a lot of support from galleries, then what kind of support can we give to communities that maybe don't exist in Philly?
That's great. Kind of scaling back to kind of larger communities, Jane is asking us on a global scale if there are any industries which are already kind of actively applying design thinking, on that day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that there are many. I think like one of the more obvious ones are the web-based platforms, and so something like Facebook, for example, you've really seen how it started off as a social networking platform for college students to send messages to each other and communicate. And I think through design thinking, through understanding the scope of what it's trying to accomplish, it's now become a communications platform. Mm-hmm. And it's not just a place where people are sending each other messages and poking each other. I don't know if people even poke each other anymore, but now it's also a news network. It's a place where people are learning design thinking on Facebook Live. There's all these different ways that Facebook has transformed itself because of following those steps of design thinking. I think Apple as well is a great example of something, a company that has brought technology literally to the fingertips of people who in the past felt that it was inaccessible. So my grandma never had a computer in her entire life, but she has an iPad. And I think that that's a great example of a situation where someone was afraid of technology and then someone else designed a piece of technology that could then seem welcoming.
Mm-hmm. I know my dad loves to spend so much time on his iPad just kind of learning new languages mm-hmm. and reading up on the news and catching up with that.
Yeah.
We know that, so we have a couple more questions coming from our audience. Janelle says, should a person enroll in data sciences, IT, or computer sciences to be able to kind of create effective design?
I think that there are a bunch of different ways to learn design, and I think that would be a more formal way of going about learning. But I think that if you're just kind of experimenting and just introducing yourself to it, honestly, you could go on YouTube and search design thinking, and there's some great talks about that. There's also a great website called lynda.com, lynda.com, and that's a great platform where I think you can do even a trial period where you can take any kind of design or multimedia class, anything from graphic design to film editing, and there may even be courses around kind of the principles of design thinking. So I would start off with online courses and things like that, just because it's a relatively new concept, mm-hmm. and so the things that you find online, the education for that is probably just as good as any kind of formalized institution might have design thinking right now.
Those are all great resources. We'll definitely come back to that a little bit more. I'm curious to pick your brain on that. Mm-hmm. But we have a couple more questions. Tony is asking us, how can we apply design thinking to kind of maybe existing projects where it's not currently being utilized?
I think that's design thinking is best used in places where it's not currently being utilized, right? And I think that something that is kind of can kind of be difficult to wrap one's head around are really, if you spend a day and just look at all the things that you've gotten used to, even though they're not ideal, those are all situations where they could be design thinking, right? And so a great example might be let's say that in your living room you have a coffee table that you're always bumping your shin against, right? Mm-hmm. And then you just do it all the time to the point where you've gotten used to it. like you could then take a look at that and not just say, oh, okay, well, let me just move the table so I don't, hurt my leg anymore. But then you actually look at the entire room and think about, well, if this is a room that I'm constantly navigating in and out of, how can I make it so that this is the most conducive space for that kind of transportation, right? And that's a really simple way to apply it in your own living room. Mm-hmm. And then you can then think about, okay, well, how can I go about that way of thinking in my next meeting, right? So maybe you go to staff meetings and they're always super duper boring. There can be, an opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to lead the staff meeting this time around, and then completely restructure it in a way where you get all the things accomplished that you normally get accomplished, but maybe everybody leaves feeling energized and feeling like they had fun.
Absolutely. That's great. And I'm kind of dealing with that team approach in meetings and things like that. I'm curious, when we're working on design, and working in a team, how do you kind of approach different conflicts? What do you do when you have differences of opinion?
I think that the first step of design thinking, of empathy, is really important there, because I think when we all care about a project, but we have different opinions, I think that's where things get really heated. And it's a great opportunity to step back and just say, okay, well, I know that we all, have different opinions right now, but the reason is because we all commonly care about the same thing, right? And then so sometimes at that point, I think even, at the tech camp that we were at, we were all working towards, ways of solving, human trafficking, right? And we had these different approaches, and everybody was really passionate, and so we just kind of stepped back and took a 10-minute break, and then we came back, and then everybody went around and just talked about what is it that they care really deeply about, that they want to make sure that they accomplish with this session. And then it ended up that all those different things that everyone cared deeply about could actually coordinate in a really nice and smooth way, but we were focusing so much on the problem that we weren't focused on the solution.
The balance of opinion is very, very crucial. I'm kind of curious, how do you balance aesthetics with information to get to kind of a area where you have a result or plan that you want to convey?
Yeah, I think that one thing that design is really good for helping us understand is that it doesn't matter how good your information is if nobody wants to look at it or listen to it, right? And so, so for example, oftentimes we'll spend a whole bunch of time researching something and then put out a really long document with a bunch of small words without any kind of grabber for the public to engage with it, and then we put it out there into the universe because we did the work, and then we wonder why nobody read it, right? I think that this is where aesthetic comes in. Sometimes it can be about editing, looking at how we can say things with less words. And then if once we get to a point where we're like, okay, well, these are all the words we have to use, then how can we make it something that's a bit more compelling for people, right? So think about, how is it easier for people to get to? Is it easier for people to read if it's being printed and published, or is it easier for people to read online? And sometimes it's different with different situations. If someone's reading it on a phone, how do we make sure that it's not something that people have to keep on pinching and zooming to read, but how do we actually make it something that someone has a pleasant experience by scrolling through it, or flipping through pages or tabs and things like that? And so, people may have heard the terminology of user experience, and that's applied for websites and apps, but it can also be applied for even something like a written report.
That's great. We have been blowing through a lot of questions from the audience. We're going to leave with one last question. So do you have any leadership tips or design thinking tips in general for YSEALI members?
Yeah, so I think that as a leader, it's really important to really be steadfast in one's beliefs. I think especially because sometimes being a leader means having unpopular opinions. That said, I think being a leader also means finding success in your team, also finding success. And so I feel the most fulfilled when everybody in my team feels like they're fulfilled too. And and so as a leader, I'm constantly asking people how they're doing, how they're feeling about the project, and then if everybody is great with it, then I know I'm doing a good job.
It's fantastic advice. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today to talk about design thinking, but please come back next Tuesday, September 19th at the same time for our next Tech Tuesday Facebook Live. We're going to be talking about digital marketing with Anantya van Bronckhorst, who's the Director of Girls in Tech in Indonesia. You can stay up to date on Tech Tuesday and a lot of other programs by liking the YSEALI Facebook page. You can also connect by visiting the YSEALI website at yseali.state.gov, where you can sign up for our email newsletter. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter, which is very simple, at YSEALI. I want to give a big thank you to Adriel Luis of the Smithsonian Institution for joining us today. I know that I learned a lot about design thinking, and I hope that you did too. I really want to give a big thank you to you, our audience, for participating in this and asking such great questions. This year, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of U.S.-ASEAN relations and the 50th anniversary of ASEAN altogether. And we really appreciate everyone, especially the YSEALI community, joining us in that celebration. So good night to everyone, and I hope to see you all next week.